Welcome to the award-winning Consumer Finance Monitor podcast, where we explore important new developments in the world of consumer financial services, what they mean for your business, your customers, and the industry. This is a weekly show brought to you by the Consumer Financial Services Group at the Ballard Spahr Law Firm. And I'm your host, Alan Kaplinski, the former practice group leader for 25 years and now senior counsel of the Consumer Financial Services Group at Ballard Spahr. And I'll be moderating today's program. For those of you who want even more information about the topic that we're going to be covering today, or anything else pertaining to consumer finance, don't forget about our blog, which goes by the same name as our podcast show, consumerfinancemonitor.com. We've hosted our blog since 2011 when the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau became operational. So there's a lot of relevant industry content there. We also regularly host webinars on subjects of interest to those in the industry. So to subscribe to our blog or to get on the list for our webinars, please visit us at ballardspar.com. And if you like our podcast, please let us know about it. You can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you obtain your podcast programs. Also, please let us know if you have ideas for any other topic that we should consider covering or speakers that we should consider inviting as guests on our show. We're very proud to report that podcast database service Million Podcasts has ranked Ballard Spahr's Consumer Finance Monitor podcast in the top 25 among hundreds of financial services podcasts nationally. The service recently published a list of the top 100 financial services podcasts. Consumer Finance Monitor also ranks as the top law firm podcast among the top 100 financial services podcasts, as well as the only one focused on consumer financial services. So let me tell you about what we're going to talk about today. And we very often talk about regulations because we focus a lot on Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Federal Trade Commission and what the prudential banking agencies are up to when it comes to regulating or providing guidance. We very seldom focus on legislation as such. And today, that is the topic. An article was written very recently that was published in the University of Chicago Law Review, and it's called Legislating for the Future. And the article discusses the dynamics around enacting legislation through Congress that aims to increase the stability of the financial system and prevent financial crises. So we're going to talk today about the co-author of the article, Legislating for the Future, Professor Jonathan Gould. And we're going to talk about why passing this sort of legislation is so difficult and what Congress might be considered doing about that in order to make it easier to get legislation through that's really meaningful. So let me introduce first Jonathan Gould. Jonathan is the class of 1965 professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley. His research focuses on the relationship between politics and law and draws on a variety of methods and literature, including from public law, public theory, and political science. He's written on a range of topics, including constitutional law and theory, administrative law, and Congress and the legislative process. He's been published in all the major flagship law reviews, including, of course, Harvard, Yale, NYU, Virginia, Chicago, Michigan, Georgetown, and Vanderbilt, as well as various specialty and peer-reviewed journals. He received his JD degree and his PhD from Harvard Law School, where he served as president of the Harvard Law Review. So, Jonathan, a very warm welcome to you. I'm absolutely delighted that you're on our program today.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's terrific to be here.
Okay, so I'm going to start with some questions that will enlighten our audience about why there is a problem in enacting financial services legislation through Congress. And it's difficult to get anything passed through Congress, as anybody who's been following what's been going on during this term that began on January 20th with President Trump, and even the last 4 years under President Biden. But we're going to be focusing on financial legislation. And so the question number one for you, a really foundational question, is why study financial stability legislation?
Absolutely. And I'll say more in a second on why it's hard, but why study it is obvious in one respect, and then there's something subtle in a second. The obvious piece is that finance is a big deal, that our financial lives matter to us as individuals. Certainly the state of the economy matters to our national well-being and prosperity. And we should know whether that system is stable and what the determinants of stability are and what the risks of that stability are. And legislation is certainly a part of that story that Congress has, not with great frequency, but with periodic frequency throughout American history, passed laws in an attempt to make the system more stable. We obviously don't know the counterfactual, what would have happened if various laws hadn't passed. So there are folks who debate the exact effects of those laws. But this is a major area of legislative activity. This is one of the classes of big things that Congress does. And it's a really important one in its own right, given the importance of finance to all of us, that this is a part of the world, a domain of life that I don't need to tell you and your listeners matters a great deal. So that's the first point. The second point is that finance, especially a focus on financial stability, is a distinctive type of problem. And this gets to the title of the article, Legislating for the Future, is there are some types of laws that seek to prevent a present problem. The river's dirty, you want to clean it up. There are fatal car accidents, you want to put in airbags. Those are problems that are present, that are certain, that are relatively easily measurable. And then there's another class of problems where we're dealing with future-oriented risk. So think here about the risks of artificial intelligence or the risks of climate change. We have a sense of what the risks are, especially in the case of climate. We have a sense of what their magnitudes are likely to be. But the worst harms are coming down the pike in the future, and we don't know exactly when and precisely what they'll look like. And so too with financial stability, that one of the claims of the piece, and this is not necessarily true for some of the consumer-facing financial legislation, I think that looks more like car accident legislation, but financial stability, I would argue, looks more like climate and AI, which is you've got these big, huge potential risks, but there's degrees of uncertainty around them, and that makes it really hard to legislate.
Right. Although I would say, I guess artificial intelligence applies to just about every industry. It is very much a concern of companies that are in the consumer finance business. So that maybe not so much climate change, but certainly AI. So tell me, Jonathan, what are the basic dynamics that make it so hard to pass financial stability legislation?
Absolutely. So this goes back to what we can think of as kind of a basic set of public choice insights around who benefits and who's harmed from various types of legislative interventions. And the hypothesis is, well, in the case of any legislative intervention, we should look at who benefits, we should look at who's harmed, we should look at the resources and organizational ability of those groups, and then we can get some sort of insight as to whether it is likely legislation will go through or not. So let's look at who's harmed by financial stability legislation. Well, most immediately, there's harm to industry. Industry might not be able to do certain business practices that would once have been possible or profitable. There's compliance, which obviously takes time and money and personnel. So there's the immediate costs are borne by industry. In some instances, industry can pass on some or all of those costs to consumers. But at least in the immediate short term, when there's a new set of regulatory mandates on industry, it's fair to say that at least some of the costs are borne by industry. And I would note also for financial regulation, focused on stability as opposed to just consumer protection, you might be talking about a relatively small number of entities. That if you're talking about the biggest banks or the biggest non-bank entities that pose a potential threat to the stability of the entire system, we have what the political economists would call a relatively concentrated set of harms. And what we know about cases of relatively concentrated harms is those who are subject to them are relatively effective at mobilizing. That if I'm going after you and only you, Alan, you know that no one else is going to stand up to you, that this is an existential issue for you, and you're going to want to go and lobby and explain why my actions are unwise and shouldn't proceed. So that's on the harm side of the ledger. The benefit side of the ledger is very different. So what are the characteristics of the beneficiaries of financial stability legislation, assuming the legislation is well done and effective in achieving its goals? Well, a first characteristic of the beneficiaries is their diffusion. Who benefits from greater financial stability? Well, all of us, all Americans, even broader than that, non-Americans, individuals, companies. There's benefit to everyone to reducing the likelihood of the next financial crisis. And you would think that would be a positive. If everyone benefits, it should be easier to pass legislation. But actually, and this is a well-documented finding in the social science literature, when beneficiaries are diffuse, it makes it very hard to mobilize in support of legislation. Because yes, you benefit, but you only benefit a little bit, and maybe you assume I'll take care of it, and I assume the next person will take care of it, and so on and so forth. The organization of diffuse regulatory beneficiaries is very, very difficult. So that's one challenge around the beneficiary side. A second challenge is the benefits are long-term. That we might be talking about legislation passed today that prevents financial crisis in 10 or 20 years. And it's certainly possible that voters would quite reasonably be more focused on immediate short-term concerns than more long-term issues. And we know from the political science literature that members of Congress are much more focused on the short term than the long term. There's models of legislative behavior that focus on the need to win re-election. There's a real priority among members of Congress on things that will potentially have more immediate payoffs where they can claim credit for their constituents, their donors, relevant interest groups. And something that reduces the probability of a financial crisis long term is less likely to be that than something that, say, responds to an immediate crisis or provides a more immediate benefit. And then the final piece is that the benefits can be hard to see or hard to trace. So if the river is polluted and a statute is passed and the next month the river is cleaned up, we all know why it happened. Or if the bridge is crumbling and Congress appropriates a bunch of money and they fix the bridge, we all know why it happened. It's very easy to trace from the legislative outcome to the real world outcome that people care about. That's much harder with financial stability. That if we don't have a major financial crisis, is that because of Dodd-Frank? Is that because we've gotten lucky? Is that because one's coming around the corner and it just hasn't happened yet? We don't know. It's much harder in the domain of financial regulation to actually trace precise impacts with certainty of some of these regulatory interventions as compared to in other domains. And that, again, makes it harder for members of Congress. Why would you do something when you can't point to a definitive benefit that you can't then go to your constituents and say, hey, here's the thing I did, here's the thing I fixed? So all this, the combination of concentrated harms, diffuse benefits, and the fact that benefits are not only diffuse, but also long-term and hard to trace, all that creates a basic hurdle to financial stability legislation.
Okay. So how does the structure of Congress affect the difficulty of passing financial stability legislation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, everything I just said would apply, at least in theory, to any legislature any parliament, to any two-party, multi-party U.S. abroad. I mean, the basic dynamics I just articulated are kind of universal. But you're right to point to more particular features of the U.S. Congress that make things even harder. So let me point to a few. A first has to do with congressional rules. And quite simply, it's harder to pass things in the U.S. Congress than in most other legislatures. There are a lot of reasons for this. One of them, the one that gets the most attention, and probably rightfully so, is the Senate filibuster. For ordinary legislation proceeding under regular order, in order to close debate and move to a final vote, the Senate needs 3/5 of all members, which when there's a full Senate means 60 votes. And it's really hard to get 60 votes. There are a number of types of legislation that are exempt from the filibuster. I can say more about those shortly. Financial regulation isn't one of them. The basic dynamic coming out of congressional rules is that it's really hard to get 60 votes for anything. A second feature, and one that's related, is the idea of partisanship. Congress in the last 30 years has been defined by two features. One, which gets a lot of attention, is very high levels of partisanship. That's not news to anyone, that Democrats have moved left, Republicans have moved right. Bipartisan cooperation on major issues, at least, has become harder. Not impossible, but harder. But the other is that we have had a relatively closely divided Congress. That listeners who remember big chunks of the 20th century where Democrats controlled the House for decades on end, often by very, very wide margins. And we don't have that these days. That the House and Senate seem to be flipping every 2 or 4 or 6 years. When one party does have a majority, it tends to be a very narrow majority. It tends to be a short-lived majority. So the combination of partisanship, which is kind of a well-told story, plus the story of a very closely divided Congress, means it's just really hard to do big things that are going to divide the parties. We see exceptions. I mean, Dodd-Frank is probably the most notable recent exception, of course. But think about Dodd-Frank. It happened in the immediate wake of the largest financial crisis in many, many decades. We had a uniquely talented and charismatic president swept to power with unusually large majorities. And even then, they only broke the filibuster by 1 vote. There were only 60 votes in the Senate for Dodd-Frank. So even then, with all the conditions as favorable as they could have been for legislative action, it was by the skin of its teeth. So that's a partisanship issue. Another partisanship issue is, I think, going into the two parties themselves, you see why the incentives aren't there. The modern Republican Party isn't going to lead on financial stability legislation for a variety of reasons. The Democratic Party is, of course, the party that might, and the party that spearheaded Dodd-Frank among other smaller and in some cases less successful efforts. But there are a couple problems even for the Democrats, one of which is there is a bigger perceived political payoff for doing other things. So there are large constituencies mobilized around the social safety net, around healthcare, around immigration, around a variety of other issues. And it's harder to build a broad coalition on things like financial stability, in part because of some of the dynamics around diffuse beneficiaries I talked about earlier. So that's one issue for the Democrats. The other is that party leaders don't want to divide the caucus. And financial regulation is something where the Joe Manchins of the world and the Elizabeth Warrens of the world, of course, think quite differently. And if you're a party leader, one of the things you want to do is come up with proposals that are going to unify your caucus, not divide them. And financial stability legislation is unlikely to be that with the contemporary Democratic Party. So the final thing I'd say on Congress is a point about complexity. That, of course, Congress is really big, 435 members. They have thousands of staff. But I think we shouldn't underestimate just how much of a capacity problem Congress has as well. Congressional staff is smaller than it used to be. Policy problems have gotten harder. Pay for congressional staff has not kept up. So a lot of folks, when they're developing expertise, is also the age when they want to start a family and buy a house, and they end up leaving Capitol Hill. So with some notable exceptions, and the notable exceptions are really important, but with some notable exceptions, the well of expertise on financial regulation in Congress is not what it might be. And this is especially high stakes because financial regulation is a really technical area. I don't need to tell you and your listeners, this is not something one can just pick up on the weekend. This is a really technical area where there are a lot of extremely smart people at banks, at law firms, in other domains. And I think Congress to some degree is just outmatched, which is another challenge. So those are some of the big challenges. Again, they can be overcome. Dodd-Frank is an example, but I think the playing field is pretty strongly tilted against congressional action on some of these issues.
Right. So we've seen in the last several years some very large bills. Take Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, and currently the big beautiful bill that is from President Trump is pushing, and it deals with taxing and spending. It's supposed to deal with budgetary matters in order to avoid becoming subject to the 60 vote requirement in the Senate. But that doesn't stop the Republicans from trying to cram in the bill all kinds of things that are questionable whether they fit within that one exception. So why is financial regulation harder than these other types of legislation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that's been on my mind, because in some other work, one of the messages I've tried to put out into the world and expose legal scholars to is actually, for all the bashing of Congress, Congress is more productive than you think in some domains, including taxing and spending. And this article is trying to, in some ways, not subvert the stereotype, but explain the stereotype. Why is Congress less productive than one might want in this domain? So what's different? How does the Biden IRA differ from Trump's big, beautiful bill and the tax cuts under Trump 1? And various other legislation? One big part of the answer is the filibuster, as you know. The filibuster, roughly speaking, there's a lot of detail here that I'm happy to talk about, but roughly speaking, there's a filibuster exemption for fiscal legislation, taxing and spending. Most of the most important financial stability measures are not fiscal measures. They are regulatory requirements. They are mandates that private firms act in a certain way or don't act in a certain way or do this, that, or the other with respect to capital or lending or some other set of business practices. And those are pretty squarely subject to the filibuster. Are there some gray areas around what can and can't be done through the reconciliation process? Yes, but most of the more hotly contested financial regulatory topics are just that, are regulatory, and thus are pretty squarely subject to the filibuster. So that's one answer. A second answer, again, goes back to the public choice dynamics. That those public choice dynamics look very different for taxing and spending. That if you're spending money, the beneficiaries are very well defined. It's whoever's going to be getting the money. And those who are harmed is very ill-defined, is all of us as the taxpayer / the future taxpayer. So the public choice dynamics for spending and for tax cuts, which is a form of spending, is almost the mirror image of what they are for regulatory legislation. So I think that explains why so much of Congress's interventions in recent years, certainly under Biden with the IRA, but also under both Biden and Trump with COVID relief bills, Biden's kind of care agenda, which ended up not passing, has been a very heavily kind of tax and spend focused agenda, in part because the politics are just quite different and much more favorable for those than they are for regulatory goals. The last thing I'll say on this is there's a question about to what extent can spending be a substitute for regulation? So you might say, okay, the thing we care about shouldn't be spending versus regulating. The thing we care about should just be the goal. We just want to achieve a more stable financial system or less polluted rivers or whatever it is. And then the question becomes, can you use, what are the different means to an ends that you can use? And we saw something really interesting happening with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the climate goals, which had long been thought of as regulatory goals. There had been talk of things like cap and trade, which is a regulatory solution. Given the inability to pass a regulatory solution, proponents said, okay, we're going to pivot. We're going to come up with a tax and spend solution. And you had things like clean energy tax credits and vehicle and subsidies for electric vehicles and other things. So you had a kind of taxing and spending solution substituting for regulatory solutions. So then the question becomes, and this is more for you and your listeners than for me, are there such substitutes in the financial regulation space? And I think it's harder. There are certainly some things. I mean, if you ratcheted up funds for certain types of enforcement, that would be one way in which you could spend money in a way that sort of substitutes for new regulatory requirements. But of course, it's an imperfect substitute. And I think in the financial stability space, kind of the hypothesis we put out in the paper somewhat tentatively is there are less likely to be good spending substitutes for regulation, which means the inability to do regulation will be higher stakes.
Right. So has it gotten easier or harder over time? My guess is harder, right?
Yeah, I think it has gotten harder, and it's largely for all the reasons we've talked about. So I'll just be brief on this, but I think Congress's capacity has gone down, polarization has gone up. I think anti-regulatory sentiment, which there's obviously always been anti-regulatory sentiment for a long time in this country. But my sense, and I haven't done a comprehensive study of this, but in days gone by, the anti-regulatory sentiment often seemed to be kind of pragmatic in character, was about the cost of regulation or excessive red tape. Now, more and more, we're seeing a kind of anti-regulatory sentiment that seems more ideological in character. It's not about the cost, it's about liberty. It's about the regulation infringes on my rights, not just that it infringes on my bottom line. And that creates a much trickier politics, that when regulation doesn't just need to justify itself as more likely to pass a cost-benefit analysis, say, but also needs to deal with kind of categorical claims that it's violating the rights of the regulated party, which is certainly the discourse around, I mean, to take examples in other domains, things like COVID vaccines, things like guns, the kind of discourse around regulation in those areas has been a discourse of rights, not of benefits and costs. I think that can also contribute to making it harder for Congress to act.
Right. So what happens after financial stability legislation is enacted?
Yeah, well, it becomes the law in the books, and for many, certainly for many Congress watchers, that's the end of the story. I don't think it should be the end of the story, because we identify in the paper a few dynamics in which even after legislation is enacted, everything we've talked about in the last 20 minutes suggests it'll be really hard to enact legislation. But even after it is enacted, it might weaken over time. How might it weaken over time? There are a couple of ways. One is what we might think of as kind of ordinary policy drift. That even if no one does anything, mandate X, which in 2025 is really effective, might not be as effective in achieving its goals by 2030 or 2035 or 2040 for the simple reason that the world changes. So there can be a kind of natural decay in the effectiveness of regulatory interventions. And if Congress is only going to intervene after a crisis and is not going to do updating and tweaking, then the likelihood of that sort of policy decay or policy drift is going to be higher. So that's a first point. Another point, and a less subtle point, is sometimes Congress just undoes its old work. So there have been repeals of parts of Dodd-Frank, of parts of Sarbanes-Oxley, and regulated parties just get a second bite at the apple, that even if they don't like parts of the legislation that has passed, they're going to be able to, in 2 or 4 or 6 years, potentially go back to a new administration or under changed circumstances and try to get parts of the legislation repealed. So that's in terms of Congress kind of eroding its own work. You can also see agencies erode Congress's work. That Congress passes a new statute, but agencies don't enforce it or don't enforce it as robustly as Congress envisioned. And that could be for ideological reasons, that could be for resource or capacity reasons, that could be for any set of reasons, but these statutes might not have the teeth that some hope and others fear just by virtue of agency action or inaction. And again, I don't need to tell you that as a close watcher of the CFPB, that agency action or inaction matters a great deal, and these statutes depend heavily on agencies for enforcement. And a final point is judicial review, is to the extent to which these statutes end up in court, there's the possibility the courts will construe them broadly, but there's also the possibility the courts will construe them narrowly and kind of hem in Congress's handiwork. And in some relatively unusual but important circumstances, courts might even find a statutory intervention unconstitutional. So you've got this kind of policy drift or decay, and then you've got potential additional bites at the apple by Congress, by agencies, and by courts, all of which I think are more likely to point in the direction of weakening the statute than of strengthening it.
So, Jonathan, you've done a great job in describing the problem that exists. Let's now tell the audience about solutions. I know you go into that in a great deal in your article, but let's we haven't got time to cover everything, but let's start with what can Congress do to enhance its capacity in this area?
Absolutely. And I'll try to be quick because there's a broad range of potential solutions, none of which are a silver bullet, but I think each of which can move the needle in terms of enhancing Congress's capacity. And on capacity in particular, the easy thing is staffing. That Congress could hire more people, it could pay them better, it could make working on financial stability issues in Congress a really desirable place to be. perhaps not as desirable as the private sector in terms of pay, perhaps not as desirable as the SEC in terms of certain types of prestige, but Congress could be doing a lot better than it is right now at attracting more people and more really good people to work on these types of issues in Congress. So I think folks who are there would welcome a greater number of talented colleagues. That my understanding is that there's more than enough work to keep plenty of good people busy. So that's the biggest thing I would say on capacity, is just kind of a staffing point.
Right. Let's talk about legislative drafting. There are certain types of techniques that can be used in drafting legislation that would be promising in terms of solving the problem that you've discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about a couple of things. One of them is the idea of automatic updating. So often we think about Congress passing a statute and say the statute has some numbers in it, and those numbers are higher or lower, and there's big debate during the legislative process about what those numbers should be. But another approach that Congress has occasionally used, and that some scholars have encouraged it to use more, is the idea of automatic updating. That what if there's one number in ordinary times, but automatically it becomes a different number if unemployment rises above a certain level, or if the stock market drops a certain percentage, or if some other set of conditions are triggered.
Inflation, I guess, might be another.
Inflation, absolutely. That if inflation goes either above or below a particular level, you could imagine particular provisions kicking in. And I find these really attractive because it allows Congress to act in advance during calmer times and figure out, okay, what's the optimal policy intervention for many different types of situations that could obtain in the future, as opposed to what we've seen in the past, which is wait for the crisis to hit. You have to pass some sort of crisis legislation. That legislation is more responsive to the crisis than oriented toward preventing the next crisis. So I think kind of automatic updating, what's sometimes called triggers, is really attractive. The other idea, I think that's our main proposal. Our secondary proposal is to think more about what's sometimes called sunrise lawmaking, which is kind of, as we all familiar with a sunset, which is the provision is in effect now and goes out of effect later. And a sunrise is just the opposite, that you pass the provision now, but it has a phase-in date 3 or 5 or even some longer number of years from now. And the idea is that could, at least in theory, blunt some industry or regulated entity opposition. That if some of the opposition is around compliance costs, is around onerous new requirements coming into force very quickly, having these sunrise provisions might change the politics of that. Again, probably not dramatically. It probably won't flip opponents to supporters, but might at the margin change how people think about the law.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the role that federal agencies could play in augmenting congressional capacity. What can you tell us about that? What role is there for the agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about a few things in the piece. I mean, the standard one is Congress just delegates power to agencies. So Congress can't figure out precisely how it wants a regulatory scheme to look. So it delegates rulemaking power to agencies to figure it out. Certainly Congress doesn't do enforcement on its own. It delegates to agencies enforcement power. And that's kind of a very standard delegation story, and one that exists in this and many other areas of regulatory law and is, I think, pretty unsurprising and uncontroversial. I think Congress could be a little more creative in terms of how it interacts with agencies. That Congress could mandate agency action. Congress could set floors, but allow agencies to set ceilings themselves. So a kind of partial delegation rather than a full delegation. Congress could require a certain number of inspections or audits. I mean, Congress could do more in terms of trying to spur agencies into action. That if one of the concerns that an action-taking Congress might have about agencies is that agencies might be less inclined to action than Congress, which will sometimes be true, but not always. Congress has some tools in its portfolio, not just to delegate to agencies, which is quite standard, but also to impose mandates on agencies of what they have to do. One note on all this is a time of great instability, of course, as you know, in how we think about the powers of federal agencies. There have been a number of decisions that have cut back on agency power. There may well be more in the coming few years. So all this is taking place in the shadow of issues around agency independence, issues around major questions, issues around non-delegation potentially. So I'll just flag.
Well,
now.
yeah, and of course you're referring, without naming it, landmark decision that came down about almost a year ago. It's almost a year. The Loper Bright Enterprises opinion, which in the opening line overruled the Chevron deference doctrine. And ever since that happened, agencies now recognize that regulations that they may issue aren't as it's not always as certain as it used to be that they're going to be upheld by the courts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I've written about the Chevron issue and taught Loper Bright just a couple weeks ago. I mean, the one thing I would say is that Loper Bright in a meaningful way kicks the ball back to Congress's court. That Loper Bright doesn't say no deference ever. It says we're not going to read a statutory ambiguity to be an implied delegation. But Loper Bright is quite clear that if Congress expressly delegates a zone of discretion to the agency can act within that zone of discretion. So in some ways, Loper Bright, while not a decision I've endorsed, is one that might push Congress in the best case toward doing some of the things I would hope Congress would be doing. The challenge, of course, is that the, I think, overly aspirational view of Congress that Loper Bright and some of these other decisions have might in the end just result in Congress doing nothing and agencies doing less. And I think probably the aggregate result of this, which is why it's been praised by many on the right and critiqued by many on the left, is less robust regulatory operation. So that's certainly the bottom line. But I do think that Loper Bright is, at least in theory, consistent with some of what I've been saying here.
Right. So what role is there, or if any, for states or for private plaintiffs to play in augmenting congressional capacity?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, you might think, okay, in many domains of life, we have the federal government not acting, but we have private rights of action. We have state governments. Can they act? And the answer is, of course, potentially. And I don't want to say that there's no possibility of state or private enforcement kind of substituting for limits on federal capacity. But I think it's limited in a few ways. One way is that there's just greater costs at the state level of states imposing different requirements, and private firms, of course, complying with 50 different regulatory regimes is harder than complying with one regulatory regime at the federal level. States also often don't have the knowledge that doing good systemic financial regulation obviously requires understanding the entire financial system. And if you're in one state, you're unlikely to have the insight into the system as a whole that the federal regulators have. So again, there's possibility there, but there's reason to think it's not a panacea or a perfect substitute. And so too for private parties. I mean, Congress has enabled private enforcement in the environmental context, in the civil rights context, in many, many other contexts. The knowledge problem that state regulators have is, of course, going to be even more acute for private parties. That I can know if my ox is gored. It's very hard for me to know if my ox is gored in a way that creates a systemic risk. I mean, that's the type of thing that's going to be very, very hard for any private party to know. I do think there's some extent to which, and my co-author has written a little bit about this, kind of not traditional private enforcement of the sort of private party files lawsuit in court, but harnessing private parties to do certain types of monitoring. So, for example, regulators require banks to monitor third parties for systemic risk and consumer protection. So in that case, banks are being kind of enlisted as quasi-regulators vis-a-vis other parties they do business with. So I think there's creative work to be done on harnessing states and third parties. I just think we shouldn't overstate the good that it can do and recognize that it's very much a kind of second best to having an effective federal regulatory system.
Mm-hmm. So what relevance, Jonathan, does this all have going beyond financial regulation?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say briefly, this is kind of where we're moving toward the end, and this is roughly where we started, where I mentioned climate and artificial intelligence, is that I think the article is in some ways a case study around how to think about things that are necessary and even good, that have tremendous benefit, but also come with real risks. So finance is necessary and good. Technological innovation around AI is necessary and good. Burning fossil fuels has created a lot of growth and prosperity. All that said, each of those things come with real risks to safety, to stability, to the environment, to civil rights, and so on and so forth. So the question then becomes, I think this is a case study in thinking about how to deal with something that is desirable, that shouldn't be banned. No one wants to ban finance. But how can we channel the practice so its desirable effects are able to flower while, of course, limiting the potential for financial crises or other undesirable effects? And a lot of, for finance, AI, and climate, for all those areas, it's very future-oriented, going back to our title, Legislating for the Future, in a way that a lot of other legislation is much more oriented toward present harms.
Right. So got one final question for you before we wrap it up, and that is the article that you wrote, Legislating for the Future, which is in the University of Chicago Law Review. It was written about a year ago, so well before the election, well before the change in administration. Are any of your conclusions altered by these more recent events?
It's a great question and has been on my mind. That we wrote this exactly a year ago, last spring and summer, and it was published earlier this year. And last spring and summer do feel like a political eternity ago now. I would say the core conclusions we completely stand by. I think everything in the article remains correct. The one thing I would change or add if I were doing it again today is that the unitary executive and the role of independent agencies doesn't play a major role in the piece. I think we advert to it once or twice. But we are now seeing a movement by the White House to take control over greater and greater parts of the executive branch. We're seeing attacks on the very idea of independent agencies. Courts have weighed in and will continue to weigh in on independent agencies, including independent financial agencies. Obviously, the Saylor Law decision was a big decision about the independence of the CFPB, but I think there will be increased discussion in the coming months about the SEC, the FTC, the Federal Reserve, and other independent regulatory agencies. So I think there's probably more to be said on that. And if anything, that potentially heightens these concerns around agency erosion and probably increases the need for mandates on agencies. That if agencies are going to be declining to regulate because they're more squarely controlled by a president with an anti-regulatory agenda, and we think at least some regulation in this domain is a good thing, I think that ramps up pressure on Congress to do things like mandates rather than discretionary delegations, is the thing I'd say.
Right. Yeah, we're interesting that you mentioned the unitary executive theory. That issue is also coming directly to the Supreme Court in connection with the recent firings by President Trump of the Democratic members of a whole host of so-called independent agencies. And Trump, despite the fact that there's language in a lot of these controlling statutes dealing with the agencies saying that members of the governing boards can only be terminated for good cause, he has concluded that that's unconstitutional, that you can't put handcuffs on the presidency when it comes to firing people who he doesn't want for whatever reason he doesn't want. And so he's taking a run at it. He's had not very much luck in the lower courts, but my belief is, I may be proven wrong, but my belief is that this Supreme Court is going to kind of essentially give a lot of credence to the unitary executive theory and is going to conclude that Trump was right, that he'll be vindicated in connection with all the firings that he's done, notwithstanding a 1935 Supreme Court case, which came out the other way, where a member of the Federal Trade Commission got fired, and the Supreme Court concluded that the firing was unlawful because of language in the Federal Trade Commission Act. A little bit off topic here, but I think we are, with this Supreme Court and this president, this unitary executive theory, which Not a lot of people were thinking about it during the last administration. It's now front and center. So,
yeah, I think that's exactly right. I agree with everything you said, both in terms of describing the posture and predicting results. I mean, the old Yogi Berra line, the predictions are hard, especially about the future. And this Supreme Court has surprised us before, but I absolutely agree with you. I think the most likely thing will be a robust reading of the president's Article 2 powers to allow him to fire the heads of what have been independent agencies for a century now. And that the decision you mentioned, the Humphreys executor decision, will either be overruled or be so narrowed to be functionally overruled, I think is I think where we're headed in the next year.
I think about the only agency whose independence may be retained by the Supreme Court is the Federal Reserve Board. They went out of their way in connection with something on the so-called shadow docket, not in connection with a petition for a writ of certiorari, but in connection with a request for a stay that had been granted by the lower court, granting a preliminary injunction against the firing of members of the NLRB and one other agency. And the Supreme Court stayed that order, but went out of its way in dictum to say, however, don't worry about the Federal Reserve Board. That's completely different. And it provided some reasons for that didn't make a lot of sense to me as a banking lawyer, but so be it. Well, anyway, Jonathan, we have come to the end of our program today. And I really want to thank you again for agreeing to be our guest and for doing a great job in describing what I thought was a very thoughtful law review article that was brought to my attention. And that's the reason why I invited you on our show.
Thank you so much, Alan. It was great to be here. Really appreciate it.
And to make sure that you don't miss any of our future episodes, subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform, be it Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, wherever you listen. And don't forget to check out our blog, consumerfinancemonitor.com, for daily insights on the financial services industry. And if you have any questions or suggestions for our show, please email us at podcast, that's singular, at ballardspar.com. Stay tuned each Thursday for a new episode. Thank you again for listening today, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day.